Drive north from San Francisco on Interstate 680, cross the Benicia-Martinez Bridge, and look west. You'll see them. Grey hulks lined up in neat rows along Suisun Bay. Rusting. Silent. Waiting. At its peak in 1950, this ghost fleet numbered 2,277 ships, the largest mothball navy in human history. Liberty ships that carried the arsenal of democracy across U-boat-infested waters. Victory ships that supplied the Pacific Island hopping campaign. Destroyers that hunted submarines from the North Atlantic to the Philippine Sea. Tugboats that fought fires at Pearl Harbor while bombs still fell. These weren't abandoned wrecks. They were a national insurance policy, a floating reserve ready to sail within weeks if America ever needed them again. And America did need them. 540 ships reactivated for Korea. Another 172 for Vietnam. Hundreds more deployed to haul grain during famines and coal during fuel crises. The Ghost Fleet answered every call. Then something changed. The ships stopped leaving. They started rotting. Paint peeled into the water. Oil leaked from cracked hulls. 20 tons of toxic heavy metals, lead, copper, zinc, cadmium, slowly poisoned the bay. By 2007, environmental groups were calling it a floating toxic waste dump. By 2017, almost all of them were gone. Not reactivated, not preserved, scrapped. Towed through the Panama Canal to breaker yards in Texas, cut apart with torches, melted into rebar. This is the story of why America built the greatest reserve fleet in history, why that fleet saved the nation in 3 wars, and why the government let it rot until there was nothing left to save. Welcome inside the Ghost Fleet, where America's insurance policy became America's toxic liability. November 1918. The war to end all wars is over. American doughboys are coming home, and the United States Navy finds itself with a problem nobody anticipated. Too many ships. The Great War demanded a massive fleet. Destroyers to hunt U-boats, cargo vessels to carry troops and supplies across the Atlantic, auxiliary ships to support operations from Norfolk to the North Sea. America built them by the hundreds. Fast, expensive, state-of-the-art. Now the guns are silent. The Kaiser has abdicated. The world is at peace. And Congress looks at the enormous naval budget and sees an obvious place to cut. The logic seems unassailable. Why maintain a wartime fleet when there's no war to fight? The League of Nations will preserve the peace. Diplomacy will replace battleships. The era of great power conflict is finished. So the ships are mothballed, anchored in reserve fleets at Philadelphia, San Diego, and a half-dozen other ports. Sailors call these anchorages red lead rows, because the red primer shows through peeling grey paint within months. The preservation techniques are primitive. Slaked lime in pans to absorb moisture, canvas covers over hatches, a thin coat of grease on moving parts. That's it. Through the 1920s and 1930s, the Navy shrinks to roughly 350 ships and 90,000 personnel. The mothballed vessels rust quietly at their moorings. Nobody checks on them. Nobody maintains them. Nobody thinks they'll ever be needed again. Then Adolf Hitler rises to power. By 1939, Nazi Germany is terrorizing Europe. France falls. Britain stands alone. Winston Churchill, the new Prime Minister, sends a desperate message to President Franklin Roosevelt. Britain needs destroyers, immediately. Without them, the U-boats will strangle the island nation into submission. Roosevelt looks to the mothball fleet. 50 destroyers sit at anchor, theoretically ready for reactivation. The destroyers for bases deal is struck. America trades the aging warships for 99-year leases on British bases in the Caribbean and Atlantic. There's just one problem. The destroyers have been neglected for 20 years. Hulls have corroded, systems have seized, entire vessels have deteriorated beyond safe operation. Crews struggle to make them seaworthy. Some barely survive the Atlantic crossing. British sailors who receive them mutter that these ships should have been scrapped years ago. Then, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. America is at war, and the Navy discovers the true cost of 2 decades of neglect. The ships needed to replace losses, to escort convoys, to project power across 2 oceans. They don't exist. The mothball fleet that was supposed to provide surge capacity has rotted into uselessness. The lesson burns itself into the minds of naval planners. You cannot rebuild a navy overnight. You cannot improvise maritime power. A nation that scraps its ships in peacetime bleeds in wartime. Congress makes a silent vow. This mistake will never be repeated. When the next war ends, America will preserve its fleet properly. Maintain it. Keep it ready. But first, America needs to build the ships that will win this war. And for that, they need a man who has never set foot in a shipyard in his life. Henry John Kaiser has never built a ship. He's built dams, Hoover Dam, Bonneville Dam, Grand Coulee Dam, massive concrete monuments to American engineering prowess. But ships? He's been inside a shipyard exactly once in his life. None of that matters in December 1940. Britain is desperate. German U-boats are sinking merchant vessels faster than the entire world can replace them. The island nation faces starvation. Churchill's government approaches American shipyards with urgent orders. 30 cargo ships, 60 cargo ships, as many as possible, as fast as possible. Traditional shipbuilders look at the numbers and shake their heads. Impossible. Building a cargo ship takes 6 months minimum. The skilled labor doesn't exist. The capacity isn't there. The entire American shipbuilding industry produced fewer than 100 ocean-going vessels in 1940. Kaiser looks at the same numbers and sees opportunity. He establishes his first shipyard in Richmond, California, on the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay. The site is strategic. Deep water access, rail connections, room to expand. By April 1941, the Maritime Commission is requesting additional Kaiser yards. After Pearl Harbor, he starts 2 more, then 3 more. Eventually 7 Kaiser shipyards span the West Coast, from Richmond to Portland to Vancouver, Washington. But building yards is the easy part. Kaiser's real innovation is how he builds ships. Traditional shipbuilding works from the keel up. One crew starts at the bottom of the hull and works toward the top, riveting steel plates together one by one. It's slow. It requires highly skilled workers. It cannot be accelerated beyond certain limits. Kaiser throws out the entire approach. He adapts assembly line techniques from automobile manufacturing. Instead of building ships sequentially, he builds them in sections. The bow is fabricated in one area, the stern in another. Deck sections, bulkheads, engine components, all manufactured simultaneously at different stations. Then cranes lift the prefabricated sections into place and workers weld them together. Welding is the key. Riveting requires years of training. Welding can be taught in weeks. This matters because Kaiser's workforce looks nothing like traditional shipyard crews. Women comprise up to 30% of workers. African Americans are hired in large numbers, despite resistance from some unions. Migrants arrive from across the country, drawn by good wages and steady work. Kaiser doesn't just employ these workers, he takes care of them. He builds the city of Vanport, Oregon, to house 42,000 shipyard employees and their families. He provides on-site childcare. He creates a prepaid health plan that will eventually become Kaiser Permanente, the model for modern health maintenance organizations. The results are staggering. Industry average for building a Liberty ship, 230 days. Kaiser's yards reduced that to 45 days, then 30, then less than 3 weeks. In November 1942, workers at Richmond Shipyard No. 2 build the SS Robert E. Peary in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. From keel laying to launch in less than a week. President Roosevelt calls the Liberty ships dreadful-looking objects. The press nicknames them ugly ducklings. They're slow, just 11 knots. They're based on outdated British tramp steamer designs. They use old-fashioned triple expansion steam engines. None of that matters. What matters is quantity. Between 1941 and 1945, 18 American shipyards produced 2,710 Liberty ships. Another 531 Victory ships, larger, faster, more modern, follow. Kaiser's 7 yards alone build 1,490 vessels, 27% of total American production, more ships than any other company in the nation. At peak employment, 650,900 workers are building ships for the Maritime Commission. Kaiser's Richmond yards alone employ nearly 100,000 people. Women weld alongside men. Black workers climb scaffolding next to white workers. The American shipbuilding miracle becomes a social revolution conducted in steel and fire. Each Liberty ship can carry 10,800 deadweight tons of cargo. Tanks, ammunition, food, fuel, medicine. Together, the Liberty fleet transports over 5 million troops and countless millions of tons of war material. Across the Atlantic, across the Pacific, wherever the arsenal of democracy needs to go. By August 1945, America has built 5,777 ships in 5 years, the greatest shipbuilding achievement in human history. The fleet that defeated fascism on 2 oceans, victory in Europe, victory in Japan. The war is won. And now comes a question nobody has fully considered. What do you do with 5,777 ships when the shooting stops? September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur accepts Japan's formal surrender aboard the USS Missouri. World War II is over. The most destructive conflict in human history has ended. The celebrating barely begins before the logistics nightmare starts. America possesses approximately 6,700 active naval and merchant vessels, warships, cargo ships, tankers, troop ships, hospital ships, ammunition carriers, repair vessels, a maritime armada stretching across 2 oceans, scattered from the Philippines to Plymouth, from Okinawa to Oran. 12 million American service members want to go home. The pressure is overwhelming. Families flood congressional offices with letters. Mothers demand their sons return immediately. The military begins the largest human repatriation in history. Ships become the bottleneck. Every available vessel is pressed into service. Luxury liners converted to troop ships. Cargo holds retrofitted with bunks. Even some Liberty ships, never designed for passengers, carry soldiers across the Atlantic and Pacific. The operation moves millions of people in months. Then the work is done. The troops are home, and America confronts rows upon rows of empty ships. The memory of 1918 burns fresh. Naval planners remember the destroyers that rotted at anchor for 20 years. The red lead rose. The vessels too corroded to help Britain in 1940. The frantic rebuilding after Pearl Harbor. Congress has no appetite for repeating that disaster. On March 8, 1946, President Truman signs the Merchant Ship Sales Act. Section 11 creates something new, the National Defense Reserve Fleet, a permanent mothball navy, ships preserved not for scrapping but for the next emergency, insurance against the next war. The Maritime Administration, MARAD, takes custody of the surplus vessels. 8 anchorage sites are designated across the country: James River, Virginia; Beaumont, Texas; Olympia, Washington; Astoria, Oregon; Mobile, Alabama; Wilmington, North Carolina; and 2 sites in California, Benicia and Suisun Bay. Suisun Bay sits 35 miles northeast of San Francisco, where the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers merge before flowing into the larger bay. The water is brackish, fresh enough to reduce saltwater corrosion, salty enough to discourage freshwater organisms. The currents are gentle. The anchorage is protected from Pacific storms. It's nearly perfect for long-term ship storage. The first vessels arrive in 1946. 125 ships form the initial fleet at Suisun Bay. Liberty ships mostly, Victory ships, a few tankers and auxiliaries. They anchor in neat rows, grey hulls swinging gently with the tides. This time, preservation is serious business. Engineers develop sophisticated techniques to keep the ships ready for reactivation. Dehumidification machines pump dry air through the holds, preventing the moisture that breeds rust. Cathodic protection systems, zinc anodes attached to hulls, sacrifice themselves to electrochemical corrosion, sparing the steel beneath. Critical machinery is coated with preservative compounds. Fuel tanks are topped off to prevent condensation. Ventilation systems are sealed. The goal is ambitious. Any ship in the reserve fleet should be capable of reactivation within 20 to 120 days, not the months or years required after World War I. Days. A Navy commander should be able to point at a mothballed vessel in January and sail it to a war zone by spring. Through the late 1940s, the fleet grows steadily. More ships transfer from active service as the post-war drawdown continues. The Navy shrinks, the merchant marine contracts, but the reserve fleet expands. By 1950, Suisun Bay holds 340 vessels, a grey city on the water. You can see them from Highway 680, rows of ships stretching toward the horizon. They look eerie from a distance, motionless, silent, waiting. Nationwide, the numbers are even more impressive. 8 anchorages, 2,277 ships, the largest reserve fleet in human history, a navy in hibernation, an insurance policy written in steel. The vessels sleep at their moorings, dehumidifiers hum, cathodic systems sacrifice their zinc, skeleton crews patrol the decks, checking for leaks, monitoring systems, maintaining readiness. The ghost fleet waits for a call that might never come. It won't wait long. 5 years after the last Victory ship drops anchor in Suisun Bay, a different general stands before a different army. Kim Il-sung's forces pour across the 38th parallel. Korea is burning, and America discovers exactly what its mothball navy is worth. June 25, 1950. North Korean tanks roll across the 38th parallel. The South Korean army collapses within days. American forces stationed in Japan scramble to respond. President Truman commits ground troops, the United Nations authorizes military action, and the Ghost Fleet wakes up. Within weeks, activation orders flood into Suisun Bay and the 7 other anchorages. The ships that have been sleeping since 1946 are needed immediately. Cargo vessels to carry ammunition and supplies, tankers to fuel the war machine, troop ships to move reinforcements across the Pacific. The preservation systems work exactly as designed. Dehumidifiers have kept the holds dry. Cathodic protection has prevented hull corrosion. Critical machinery starts with minimal coaxing. Ships that were mothballed 5 years ago sail for Korea within weeks. By the end of the Korean War, 540 vessels have been pulled from the reserve fleet. The insurance policy is paying off, but Korea is just the beginning. October 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalizes the Suez Canal. Britain and France invade. The canal closes. Suddenly, oil tankers and cargo ships bound for Europe must sail around the Cape of Good Hope, adding thousands of miles to every voyage. The world shipping market seizes up overnight. The reserve fleet answers again. 223 cargo ships reactivate to handle the overflow. 29 tankers join them. American mothball vessels haul goods that would otherwise rot on distant docks. When the crisis ends, most return to their anchorages. The pattern repeats. Emergency strikes. Ships wake. Crisis passes. Ships sleep. Between 1951 and 1964, a different kind of activation occurs. The federal government needs floating warehouses. Grain surpluses pile up across the Midwest. Coal stockpiles exceed land-based storage capacity. Approximately 600 reserve fleet vessels spend years storing agricultural commodities. Liberty ships designed to cross oceans instead sit at anchor, their holds stuffed with wheat and corn. It's not glamorous, but it's useful. August 1961. The Berlin Crisis. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev threatens to sign a separate peace treaty with East Germany. Tensions spike. The wall goes up. President Kennedy activates reserve military units. 18 vessels from the mothball fleet are pulled for potential support operations. The crisis cools. Most ships return. Then Vietnam. The build-up begins in 1965. American troop levels escalate from advisors to battalions to divisions. The logistics demands are immense. Ammunition, vehicles, food, fuel, medical supplies, everything an army needs to fight a war 10,000 miles from home. 172 reserve fleet vessels reactivate for Vietnam. Some make multiple tours. They haul cargo to Da Nang, Cam Ranh Bay, Saigon. They ferry equipment that soldiers will use to fight in jungles their grandfathers never imagined. Kaiser's Liberty ships, designed to defeat Hitler, now support a different war in a different century. By the mid-1960s, Suisun Bay reaches its peak. More than 500 vessels anchor in the brackish water. From the highway, the fleet looks infinite. Grey hulls stretch toward the horizon, an armada frozen in time. Then something shifts. Vietnam winds down. The activations slow. Ships return to their moorings, but the calls stop coming. The vessels that answered Korea are now 25 years old. The ones that served in Vietnam are pushing 30. Technology has evolved. Container shipping is revolutionizing maritime commerce. The old breakbulk cargo ships, loading and unloading goods piece by piece, are becoming obsolete. New ships don't join the fleet. The vessels that leave for scrapping aren't replaced. The numbers begin their long decline. 2,000 ships become 1,500. 1,500 becomes 1,000. and the maintenance starts slipping. Budget cuts trim the preservation crews, dehumidifiers run less frequently. Cathodic protection systems aren't replaced when their zinc anodes deplete. Small leaks go unrepaired. Paint begins to peel. Rust spots appear on hulls that were pristine a decade earlier. Nobody notices, or rather, nobody with authority to act notices. The ships are out of sight, anchored in a quiet bay, invisible to the public. They served their purpose. They answered when called. Now they're just old vessels waiting for a disposal decision that keeps getting deferred. The ghost fleet drifts from national asset toward national afterthought. The ships still stand silent watch, but some of them are becoming too famous to ignore. Not every ship in the ghost fleet is anonymous. Some carry history in their steel. Battle stars on their records, presidential footprints on their decks, secrets so classified that decades pass before the public learns what they really did. The USS Iowa arrives at Suisun Bay in 2001. Battleship number 61, the lead ship of the last class of American battleships ever built. 58,000 tons of armor and firepower. 9 16-inch guns, capable of hurling shells weighing as much as a Volkswagen Beetle over 20 miles. But the Iowa's legacy isn't just about firepower. In November 1943, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt needs to reach Tehran for a secret conference with Churchill and Stalin. Flying is considered too dangerous. U-boats prowl the Atlantic. The President of the United States requires the most protected vessel the Navy can provide. The Iowa gets the call. For 9 days, Roosevelt lives aboard the battleship. The crew installs a bathtub specially designed to accommodate his paralysis. They build ramps for his wheelchair. They conduct anti-aircraft drills while the commander-in-chief watches from the deck. One drill goes wrong. A torpedo accidentally fires toward the Iowa from an escorting destroyer. It misses. Roosevelt reportedly asks to be wheeled to the railing so he can watch. The Iowa earns 11 battle stars across World War II and Korea. She's modernized in the 1980s, fitted with Tomahawk cruise missiles, and serves in the Persian Gulf. When the Navy finally decommissions her, she sits at Suisun Bay for a decade, waiting for a decision on her fate. In 2011, she leaves under tow, not for the scrapyard, for Los Angeles, where she becomes a floating museum at the Port of Los Angeles in San Pedro. 500,000 visitors have walked her decks since. The battleship of presidents preserved. The USS Hoga has a different kind of fame. She's a harbor tug, 100 feet long, built in 1940, stationed at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. When Japanese bombs begin falling that Sunday morning, the Hoga is one of the first vessels to respond. Her crew pushes the burning USS Nevada away from the harbor channel, preventing her from sinking and blocking the entire fleet's escape route. They fight fires on Battleship Row. They rescue sailors from the water. They spray foam on the USS Arizona as she burns. For 72 continuous hours, the Hoga fights. After Pearl Harbor, she continues serving in Hawaii before transferring to Oakland, California. For more than 40 years, she works as a fireboat for the Port of Oakland. She battles blazes on the waterfront long after her Navy service ends. When Oakland retires her in 1994, the Hoga moves to Suisun Bay. She joins the Ghost Fleet at age 54, a Pearl Harbor survivor floating among the cargo ships and tankers she once helped save. She waits there for over 20 years. In 2015, the Hoga finally leaves, not for scrapping, but for Arkansas, of all places. The Arkansas Inland Maritime Museum in North Little Rock adopts her. The tugboat that helped save the Pacific Fleet now sits landlocked in the middle of the country, 1,000 miles from salt water. Then there's the ship nobody was supposed to know about. The Hughes Glomar Explorer looks like an ordinary drilling vessel, 618 feet long, helicopter pad on the stern, derrick tower rising from the deck. Built in the early 1970s, ostensibly for deep-sea mining operations. It's a lie. The Glomar Explorer is a CIA project. Codename Azorian. In 1968, a Soviet submarine, the K-129, sank in the Pacific Ocean, 16,500 feet below the surface, 3 miles down. The Soviets couldn't find her, but American intelligence located the wreck using underwater listening systems. The submarine carried nuclear missiles, code books, encryption equipment. The intelligence value is incalculable. The CIA commissions Howard Hughes, the eccentric billionaire, to build a ship capable of retrieving the submarine without the Soviets noticing. The cover story: Hughes is developing technology to mine manganese nodules from the ocean floor. The reality: a massive claw system designed to grab a submarine from depths no salvage operation has ever reached. In 1974, the Glomar Explorer succeeds. Partially. The claw grabs the K-129, but the submarine breaks apart during retrieval. A section is recovered. What exactly the CIA obtained remains classified. After the mission, the Glomar Explorer has no further purpose. She's too specialized, too expensive, too secret. She ends up mothballed at Suisun Bay, hiding in plain sight among the Liberty ships and Victory ships. Just another grey hull on the water, her true history unknown to the fishermen who motor past. She sits for nearly 20 years before finally being converted into an actual deep-sea drilling ship. The cover story becomes real. These are the famous ones, the ships with names people recognize, but hundreds of others anchor in obscurity. Cargo vessels that hauled beans to Korea, tankers that fueled the Vietnam buildup, troop ships that carried generations of young men toward wars they might not survive. One unexpected legacy: in 1997, sound designers from Industrial Light and Magic visit Suisun Bay. They're working on a film about a shipwreck. The ghost fleet's rusting hulls produce haunting groans, metal stressed by tides and time. Those sounds end up in James Cameron's Titanic. The famous ships eventually find salvation. Museums claim them, conversions save them, their stories get told. But nobody is watching what the forgotten ships leave behind. The decline begins quietly. No single decision, no dramatic announcement, just a slow erosion of attention. After Vietnam, the reserve fleet stops being a priority. The ships served their purpose. The wars are over. Defense budgets shift toward nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, high-tech weapons systems. Maintaining old cargo ships from World War II doesn't excite anyone in Congress. The preservation crews shrink. Dehumidifiers that once ran constantly now operate on reduced schedules. Cathodic protection systems, those sacrificial zinc anodes that prevent hull corrosion, aren't replaced when they deplete. The chemistry is simple and merciless. Without protection, steel corrodes. Salt water and oxygen attack the iron. Rust forms, spreads, weakens. Paint is the first visible casualty. The grey coating that protects hulls from the elements begins to crack, peel, flake. Chips fall into the water below. At first, it seems cosmetic. Ships don't need to look pretty. They just need to float. But the paint isn't just grey pigment. It's a chemical barrier containing heavy metals that prevent marine organisms from fouling the hulls. Lead, copper, zinc, cadmium, metals that were standard in mid-century shipbuilding, metals that are toxic to virtually every living thing. Each flake that falls carries poison with it. The process accelerates through the 1980s and 1990s. Ships that were pristine in 1970 show rust streaks by 1980. By 1990, some hulls are more orange than grey. The worst vessels develop holes, water seeps in, fuel oil and lubricants seep out. Asbestos insulation, once safely contained inside engine rooms, begins to crumble and migrate. Nobody sounds the alarm. The ships anchor in a quiet bay, far from major population centres. Fishermen motor past. Commuters glimpse the fleet from Highway 680. But who's going to inspect vessels that nobody wants anymore? The ecosystem certainly can't complain. Suisun Bay sits at the heart of one of California's most important wetland systems. Suisun Marsh, the largest contiguous brackish water marsh in the western United States, surrounds the anchorage. The water supports critical habitat for Chinook salmon migrating toward Sacramento River spawning grounds. Delta smelt, a small fish found nowhere else on Earth, depends on this exact salinity gradient for survival. The bay serves as a major stopover on the Pacific Flyway, hosting hundreds of thousands of migratory birds each year. Into this ecosystem, the ghost fleet bleeds. Government scientists begin documenting the contamination in 1997. The findings are alarming. Sediment samples near the ships show elevated levels of heavy metals. Lead concentrations exceed thresholds for hazardous waste classification. Copper levels are toxic to aquatic invertebrates. The bay bottom beneath the fleet has become a chemical sink. A 2009 analysis calculates the damage. More than 20 tons of toxic metals have already leached from the deteriorating vessels into Suisun Bay. Paint chips, rust particles, oily residue, 2 decades of slow bleeding, and without intervention, an additional 50 tons will follow. The contamination isn't theoretical. Fish consumption advisories warn locals about eating catch from these waters. The irony is suffocating. Ships preserved to defend America are now poisoning American waters. MARAD faces an impossible equation. The fleet has deteriorated beyond practical reactivation. These aren't ships that can sail to a war zone in 120 days. Many can't sail at all. Some would sink if they tried, but maintaining them properly would cost fortunes. Estimates suggest $19,000 per ship per year for basic preservation. And that's for vessels in reasonable condition. The worst hulls require dry dock repairs costing $800,000 each. There's no money for that. There's barely money to keep skeleton crews checking for immediate emergencies. So MARAD does the minimum. Pump out water when ships list. Patch holes when they're discovered. Wait for disposal decisions that never come. The math doesn't add up. Too deteriorated to reactivate. Too expensive to maintain. Too toxic to simply sink. Too costly to properly dispose. The ships exist in bureaucratic purgatory. Assets on paper, liabilities in reality. The government can't use them, can't afford them, and can't get rid of them. So they rot. Year after year, flake by flake, ton by ton. The slow poison accumulates in sediment that won't be remediated for decades. It concentrates in shellfish that filter bay water through their bodies. It enters a food chain that extends from microscopic organisms to migratory birds to the fishermen who still cast lines from nearby shores. The government knows. The reports exist. The data is clear. Nobody acts, but somebody is watching. Environmental attorneys in San Francisco are building a case. Scientists are documenting violations. A coalition is forming, and they've discovered something useful. The federal government is not above the law. San Francisco Baykeeper isn't a large organization. A handful of attorneys, a small budget, a mission to protect the ecological health of San Francisco Bay. They've sued polluters before, oil companies, industrial facilities, developers who think wetlands are just inconvenient mud. But suing the federal government? That's different. In 2007, Baykeeper joins forces with two allies, Arc Ecology, a group specializing in military environmental contamination, the Natural Resources Defense Council, a national organization with deep pockets and experienced litigators. Together, they file suit against the Maritime Administration. The legal argument is elegantly simple. The Clean Water Act prohibits the discharge of pollutants into navigable waters without a permit. MARAD has no permit. The Ghost Fleet is discharging pollutants. Therefore, MARAD is breaking the law. The government's defense essentially amounts to sovereign immunity and bureaucratic paralysis. We're the federal government. We're doing our best. These ships are complicated. Disposal takes time. The plaintiffs don't accept excuses. They want evidence. Inspection teams visit Suisun Bay. What they document is damning. Ships listing at dangerous angles. Rust holes visible above the waterline. Oil sheen spreading across the surface. Paint chips floating like toxic confetti. One vessel has deteriorated so severely that inspectors question whether it will survive another winter. The evidence isn't ambiguous. You don't need a chemistry degree to see that these ships are falling apart. You don't need sophisticated testing to know that the rainbow shimmer around certain hulls isn't natural. The contamination is visible to anyone who bothers to look. Attorneys depose MARAD officials. The testimony reveals years of deferred maintenance, budget requests denied or reduced, preservation systems left broken, ships known to be environmental hazards kept at anchor because removing them would cost money nobody wanted to spend. The government's own documents become weapons. Internal reports acknowledge the contamination. Memos discuss the deteriorating conditions. Studies quantify the heavy metal releases. MARAD knew. The evidence is in their own filing cabinets. The case moves toward trial. Discovery continues. Expert witnesses prepare testimony. Environmental scientists calculate the ongoing damage. The coalition's lawyers build a record that will be difficult to dispute. January 2010. Federal Judge Frank C. Burrell issues his ruling. MARAD is violating the Clean Water Act. The discharge of pollutants from the reserve fleet vessels is illegal. The federal government, despite its protests about complexity and funding, is not exempt from environmental law. The ships are poisoning Suisun Bay, and the poisoning must stop. The ruling doesn't immediately fix anything, but it changes the equation. MARAD can no longer hide behind bureaucratic inertia. A federal judge has declared their operations unlawful. Continued inaction means continued violation. March 2010. The parties announce a settlement. The terms are specific, aggressive, unprecedented. MARAD must clean all ship decks within 120 days. Hull cleaning must be completed within 2 years. All 57 obsolete vessels currently anchored at Suisun Bay must be removed by 2017. The worst polluters go first. The settlement doesn't just set deadlines. It establishes accountability, regular reporting requirements, inspections, penalties for missed targets. The environmental groups retain the right to return to court if MARAD fails to comply. Cleanup operations actually began months earlier, in October 2009, as the litigation pressure mounted. Ships start moving to Mare Island, a former naval shipyard across the bay, for initial processing. Workers in protective suits scrape decks, collecting paint chips and rust that would otherwise fall into the water. The work is dirty, dangerous, and necessary. The numbers accumulate. 140 tons of paint and rust chips collected from decks alone. Material that would have become bay sediment is instead bagged, labeled, and disposed of as hazardous waste. Each ton removed is a ton that won't poison salmon or accumulate in shellfish. But cleaning isn't enough. The ships must go. Removal means scrapping. Most vessels will travel to Brownsville, Texas, where specialized facilities dismantle obsolete ships. The journey takes 45 days through the Panama Canal. Some vessels are so deteriorated that observers wonder if they'll survive the voyage. The economics are brutal. Total cleanup and disposal costs will approach $57 million. MARAD recoups roughly $30 million from scrap metal sales. The net cost, $27 million to dispose of ships that were supposedly national assets. The insurance policy has become a liability. The reserve fleet that was meant to save money by preserving vessels for future use has instead cost fortunes in environmental damage and remediation. Every year of deferred maintenance, every budget cut, every ignored warning, the bill comes due eventually. The settlement is a victory for the bay, for the environmental groups, for the principle that federal agencies must follow the laws they enforce on everyone else. It's also an admission. America let its mothball fleet rot. America poisoned its own waters. America spent decades pretending the problem would solve itself. Now, the ships must make one final voyage. Not to war, not to carry cargo, not to serve any national purpose, to the scrapyard, to be cut apart with torches and sold for pennies per pound, to disappear. The ritual begins before a ship ever leaves Suisun Bay. First, the deck cleaning. Workers in protective suits descend on the vessel with scrapers and vacuums. Every loose paint chip, every rust flake, every fragment that might fall into the water during transit. The debris goes into bags, the bags into containers, the containers into hazardous waste facilities. Nothing escapes. Then the ship moves to dry dock. Mare Island, the former naval shipyard across the bay, handles initial processing. The vessel is lifted from the water, exposing a hull that hasn't seen daylight in decades. What waits below the waterline is often worse than what showed above. Rust blooms, corrosion craters, marine growth thick enough to measure in inches. Hull cleaning is brutal work. High-pressure water blasts away decades of accumulated fouling. Scrapers attack stubborn deposits. The runoff is captured, tested, treated. Invasive species that hitched rides on these hulls, organisms from distant ports that could devastate California ecosystems, must be killed before the ship moves. Only after the vessel passes inspection can it begin its final voyage. The journey to Texas takes approximately 45 days. Out of San Francisco Bay, down the California coast, through the Panama Canal, across the Gulf of Mexico, into the port of Brownsville at the southern tip of Texas. Some ships make the trip under their own power. Most are towed. A few are so deteriorated that maritime observers genuinely wonder if they'll survive the passage. Pumps run continuously on the worst vessels. Crews monitor for catastrophic leaks. The ships that once crossed oceans carrying cargo now struggle to cross oceans, carrying nothing but their own dying weight. Brownsville isn't an accident. The port offers everything shipbreaking requires: deep water access for large vessels, cheap land for sprawling operations, a labor pool willing to do dangerous work, and proximity to Mexican steel mills in Monterrey, hungry for scrap metal. 3 facilities dominate the Brownsville shipbreaking industry: International Shipbreaking Limited, ESCO Marine, and Bay Bridge, Texas. Together, they handle approximately 85% of all Navy and MARAD ship recycling. When American warships or cargo vessels need to die, they usually die here. The breaking process is methodical destruction. Workers start at the top and work down, at the bow and work back. Cutting torches slice through steel that Kaiser's welders joined 70 years earlier. The blue flame that built these ships now dismembers them. Cranes lift sections away. Winches drag heavy components across the yard. Airbags provide flotation as the hull loses buoyancy with each removed piece. Steel is the primary product. Huge slabs of it, cut into manageable sections and loaded onto trucks bound for Monterrey. Mexican smelters melt the metal down and recast it into rebar, structural beams, automobile parts. The ships that carried tanks to Normandy become the frames of apartment buildings. The vessels that hauled ammunition to Korea become shopping carts. Non-ferrous metals are separated and sold. Copper wiring, brass fittings, aluminum components. Each material has its own market, its own price, its own destination. The strangest aftermarket belongs to the fixtures, portholes, navigation equipment, deck hardware, ship's bells. Items that once served practical purposes now sell as nautical decor. Online auction sites list components from vessels whose names mean nothing to the buyers. A porthole from a Liberty ship ends up in a restaurant in Denver. A ship's wheel from a Victory vessel decorates a beach house in Florida. But the hazardous materials complicate everything. These ships were built before environmental regulations existed. Asbestos insulates their pipes and engine rooms. PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, now banned for their toxicity, lurk in electrical systems. Lead paint coats every surface. Heavy metals permeate the structure itself. Federal law prohibits exporting American government vessels for scrapping overseas. This matters because 90% of global shipbreaking happens in South Asia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, where environmental and safety standards are minimal and workers die regularly. American ships must die on American soil, under American regulations, with American costs. Those costs mount quickly. Asbestos removal requires specialized crews. PCB disposal demands licensed facilities. Lead paint generates hazardous waste that must be tracked from removal to final disposition. Breaking a ship safely and legally costs far more than breaking it recklessly. March 2010 brings a milestone. The SS Winthrop, the last Victory ship in the reserve fleet, departs for scrapping. She's one of the 531 Victory vessels built during World War II. Larger and faster than the Liberty ships that preceded them, Victory ships represented the peak of American wartime production. Now the last one goes to the cutting torches. The pace accelerates as MARAD races to meet settlement deadlines. By 2012, 36 vessels have been removed, ahead of schedule. Environmental monitors report improving water quality. The bay bottom is no longer receiving fresh contamination. By 2015, only 3 obsolete ships remain. By 2017, the cleanup is complete. The settlement terms have been met. The numbers tell the story. 57 ships removed, 140 tons of paint and rust chips collected before they could enter the water, an estimated 50 additional tons of heavy metals prevented from leaching into the bay, 14 million gallons of oil and contaminated wastewater captured and disposed, 38,000 cubic yards of PCB-contaminated material properly handled. The cleanup cost $57 million. Scrap sales recouped $30 million. The net cost, $27 million, represents the price of decades of neglect. But here's what nobody mentions. The fleet that was removed was never replaced. The ready reserve force that remains, vessels capable of activation within days, numbers in the dozens, not hundreds. New ships that join must comply with Clean Water Act requirements from the start. The era of anchoring thousands of vessels in brackish bays and hoping for the best is over. The ghost fleet is gone. The steel has scattered across a continent. The bay is healing. But the story doesn't end at the scrapyard. Some ships escaped the cutting torches, and the questions the fleet raised about preparedness, about maintenance, about the true cost of neglect, those remain anchored in place. Pull off Highway 680 at the Vista Point. Look across the water. Try to imagine 500 ships stretching toward the horizon. Grey hulls anchored in precise rows, an armada in waiting, a navy in hibernation. You can't see it anymore, because it's not there. Where hundreds of vessels once floated, a handful remain. Approximately 9 ships anchor in Suisun Bay today, not mothballed relics waiting for disposal. Active ready reserve fleet vessels maintained to modern standards. The USS Petersburg sits among them with a skeleton crew aboard. Her pollution control systems work. Her bilge water gets tested. She represents what the Ghost Fleet was always supposed to be, a ship genuinely ready to serve. The contrast with what came before is stark. These vessels have functioning preservation systems, cathodic protection that actually prevents corrosion, dehumidification that actually keeps holds dry, maintenance schedules that are actually followed. The lessons of 50 years of neglect have been learned. The question is whether they've been learned too late. 3 anchorages still operate as part of the National Defense Reserve Fleet: James River, Virginia; Beaumont, Texas; Suisun Bay, California. Together, they hold fewer than 100 vessels. Compare that to 1950. 8 anchorages, 2,277 ships. The reduction isn't gradual decline. It's near total collapse. The ships that escaped scrapping found other fates. The USS Iowa sits in Los Angeles Harbor, a floating museum visited by hundreds of thousands of people annually. Tourists walk decks where Franklin Roosevelt slept. Children peer into 16-inch gun turrets. The battleship of presidents serves a new purpose, teaching Americans about naval history they've mostly forgotten. The USS Hoga rests 1,000 miles from salt water at the Arkansas Inland Maritime Museum in North Little Rock. The tugboat that fought fires at Pearl Harbor for 72 continuous hours now sits in a landlocked state, surrounded by visitors who learn about a Sunday morning in 1941 that changed everything. Other museum ships never saw Suisun Bay but share the preservation mission. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, a Liberty ship, floats at Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. She's one of only 2 fully operational Liberty ships remaining in the world. Volunteers keep her engines running. Once a year she cruises the bay, a living reminder of what Kaiser's workers built. The SS Red Oak Victory sits in Richmond, California. at the Rosie the Riveter National Historical Park. She honors the homefront workers who made the shipbuilding miracle possible. The women who welded, the migrants who riveted, the thousands who built 747 ships at the Richmond yards alone. These survivors tell the story, but they're exceptions. The environmental legacy is harder to display in a museum. Suisun Marsh is recovering. Water quality has improved since the worst polluters departed. The sediment, however, holds memory. Heavy metals don't disappear. They settle into the bay bottom and wait. Full remediation will take decades, perhaps longer. Chinook salmon still navigate these waters toward Sacramento River spawning grounds. Delta smelt still depend on this brackish gradient for survival. Both species remain fragile. The contamination that accumulated over 30 years of neglect can't be undone in 10 years of cleanup. The ecosystem bears invisible scars. San Francisco Baykeeper still monitors the situation. The organization that sued Marad hasn't declared victory and gone home. Environmental attorneys understand that vigilance is the price of clean water. The ships are gone, but the vigilance continues. The national defense implications receive less attention. They should receive more. In 1945, America could build 6,000 ships in 5 years, 18 shipyards, hundreds of thousands of workers, an industrial base capable of producing vessels faster than enemies could sink them. That capacity won the war. Today, American commercial shipbuilding is a shadow of its wartime peak. Most large vessels are constructed overseas. China dominates global shipbuilding, producing more tonnage than any other nation. South Korea and Japan build most of the rest. American yards focus on naval vessels and specialized craft, not the cargo ships and tankers that would be needed in a major conflict. The ready reserve fleet exists to provide surge capacity in emergencies. Approximately 72 vessels nationally. Activation time, 4 to 5 days. These ships could support military operations, deliver emergency supplies, augment commercial shipping during a crisis. But 72 ships is not 5,000 ships. The fleet that answered Korea, Suez, Vietnam, that fleet numbered in the thousands. If a major war demanded rapid maritime expansion tomorrow, America would face the same problem that plagued 1941. The ships don't exist. The shipyards can't build them fast enough. The workers aren't trained. The Ghost Fleet was supposed to be insurance against that scenario. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about what happens when you stop paying premiums. James River and Beaumont face echoes of the same challenges that plagued Suisun Bay. Aging vessels, maintenance backlogs, environmental concerns. The specific ships differ, but the underlying tension remains. How do you maintain a reserve fleet when peacetime budgets don't prioritize it? Meanwhile, Brownsville thrives. The shipbreaking industry has expanded as more obsolete vessels reach end of life. International Shipbreaking Limited continues operations. The facility has dismantled aircraft carriers, the USS Kitty Hawk and USS John F. Kennedy, each displacing over 60,000 tons, each generating massive quantities of recyclable steel. Hundreds of workers find employment in an industry that exists because ships die. Welders, crane operators, hazmat specialists, the same skills that built the Liberty Fleet now dismantle its descendants. The port of Brownsville has become the third largest steel importer and exporter in the nation. Scrap metal is big business. The steel circulates. Ships become rebar. Rebar becomes buildings. Buildings house families who never know their walls contain metal from vessels that crossed oceans in wartime. The material endures even as the forms change. The ghost fleet is gone. The bay is cleaner. The marsh is healing. The remaining ships meet modern standards. And yet, stand at that vista point. Look across the empty water. Ask the question that nobody in government wants to answer. What happens next time? Drive north on Highway 680 today. Cross the Benicia Martinez Bridge. Look west toward Suisun Bay. The armada is gone. Where 340 ships once lined up in neat grey rows, you'll see open water. A few vessels remain, ready reserve ships that might still be called to service, a maintenance barge, the fading memory of something that used to matter. But the ghost fleet that defined this waterway for 70 years has vanished. The ships didn't sail away to war. They were towed to scrap yards, cut apart with torches, melted into rebar, car parts, appliances. The steel that carried the arsenal of democracy across submarine-infested oceans is now scattered through 1,000 mundane products. You might be sitting on a piece of the USS Iowa's sister ship right now. You might be driving on reinforced concrete containing metal that once held victory ships together. And if you listen closely to the silence where the fleet used to be, you can hear 3 lessons that every nation needs to understand. Lesson 1. You cannot improvise a navy. After World War I, America scrapped its fleet and told itself the world was safe. 20 years later, sailors died because ships that should have been preserved had rotted into uselessness. The ghost fleet was created to ensure that mistake never happened again. It worked. Korea called, and 540 ships answered. Vietnam called, and 172 more. Fuel crises, grain shortages, Cold War standoffs. Every time America needed surge capacity, the mothball fleet delivered. But the insurance policy only works if someone maintains it. The ships that answered Korea's call had been preserved for 5 years. The ships that sat through the 1980s and 1990s had been neglected for decades. By the time environmental groups sued, many vessels couldn't have been reactivated even if the nation needed them. The hulls had deteriorated, the systems had corroded, the ships had transformed from assets into liabilities. Preparedness isn't a one-time investment. It's a continuous commitment. The moment you stop maintaining your reserves is the moment they start becoming worthless. Lesson 2. Environmental debt compounds like financial debt. For years, the federal government did the minimum possible with the ghost fleet, just enough to keep ships from sinking, not enough to stop paint from peeling, oil from leaking, toxins from accumulating. 20 tons of heavy metals fell into Suisun Bay over decades of neglect. Lead, copper, zinc, cadmium, poison settling into sediment, entering the food chain, threatening endangered salmon and migrating waterfowl. The government knew about the contamination since at least 1997. It took a federal lawsuit in 2007 to force action. By then, the cleanup cost $57 million. If the ships had been properly maintained or removed earlier, that bill would have been a fraction of the final cost. If the pollution had continued, an additional 50 tons of heavy metals would have entered the bay. The marsh ecosystem might never have recovered. Environmental neglect is not free. It's a loan you take from the future, and the interest rate is brutal. Every year you delay remediation, the cleanup becomes more expensive, the damage becomes more permanent, and the options become more limited. The ghost fleet taught America that you cannot postpone environmental responsibility forever. Eventually, someone pays, and it's usually not the people who created the problem. Lesson 3. Symbols matter until they become liabilities. The mothball fleet was more than ships. It was a statement, a visible declaration that America could surge its maritime power at any moment. Motorists crossing the Benicia Martinez Bridge saw those grey hulks and felt reassured. That's our reserve. That's our insurance. We're prepared. But symbols can become dangerous when the reality no longer matches the image. By the 1990s, the Ghost Fleet had become a Potemkin village. It looked like military readiness from a distance. Up close, it was rust, decay, and environmental contamination. The same dynamic plays out across government. Infrastructure that looks functional but has deteriorated beyond repair. Institutions that carry impressive names but have lost their capacity. Reserves that exist on paper but couldn't be deployed in reality. The Ghost Fleet should have been honestly assessed decades earlier. Ships beyond economical repair should have been scrapped. Modern vessels should have replaced them. Instead, the fleet was allowed to decay, while everyone pretended it still represented capability. Honesty about decline is the first step toward renewal. The Ghost Fleet lied to America for years, and America believed the lie because it was comfortable. What happened to the ships? They went to Brownsville, Texas, mostly, a port town near the Mexican border that has become America's ship graveyard. Workers with torches cut them apart from top to bottom, front to back. Steel flows to smelters in Monterey. Non-ferrous metals get separated and sold. Furniture and fixtures end up on eBay. A few ships found better endings. The Iowa is a museum in Los Angeles, the only battleship on the West Coast open to the public. The Hoga, the little tugboat that fought fires at Pearl Harbor, traveled to Arkansas to become a memorial. The Glomar Explorer, the CIA's secret submarine catcher, was converted to a drilling ship and put back to work. But for every ship saved, dozens were simply erased, melted down, recycled, their steel now circulating through the economy with no memory of the battles they saw or the sailors they carried. And here's the uncomfortable truth. America never replaced the capability the Ghost Fleet represented. In 1945, the United States built 5,777 ships in 5 years. Today, American commercial shipbuilding capacity is a shadow of that era. China now dominates global shipbuilding. If a major war demanded rapid fleet expansion, America would face the same crisis it faced in 1941. Too few ships, too little time, and no reserve to draw from. The Ghost Fleet wasn't just ships, it was insurance against an uncertain future. That insurance policy has been cashed out, and nothing has replaced it. Stand at the Highway 680 Vista Point today. Look at the empty water where the armada used to be. Those ships carried presidents and prisoners, grain and guns. They fought fires at Pearl Harbor and hauled supplies to 3 wars. They hid Soviet submarines in their bellies and gave voice to Hollywood's most famous disaster. They were America's backup plan for 70 years. Now they're gone. Suisun Bay is cleaner. The salmon are safer. The government settled its environmental debt. But the strategic question remains unanswered. What happens next time America needs a surge fleet? The Ghost Fleet is silent now, but the questions it raised are louder than ever. What are we preserving? What are we neglecting? What will we wish we had kept when the next crisis arrives? The ships can't answer anymore. They're rebar now. They're car parts. their memory. But the water where they floated is still there. And if you listen closely, it's asking the same question the Ghost Fleet asked for 70 years. Are you ready? Because next time, there won't be 2,000 ships waiting to answer the call. Subscribe, because the stories hiding in plain sight are the ones that matter most. Next time, we're going inside another American institution that everyone sees, but nobody understands. And what we found will change how you look at it forever.